We have already spoken about Sergei Karjakin's meteoric rise up the world rankings at the age of just 11 and 12 years old. And he finally got his chance to play one of the world's elite in his match against, in a rapid play game in Dubai in April 2002, where he was paired against Veselin Topalov, who I believe at the time was, well, he wasn't actually world champion at the time, but he was about to become world champion soon enough. And he had a rating of 27.39, so a serious opponent for Sergei, who was rated at the time 24.60. So, of course, he ended up losing this game. I say of course, I mean, nowadays he'd give Topalov a bigger run for his money. But at the time, it showed what a learning curve he needed to have to reach the top level of chess. He'd already reached Grandmaster norms that we've talked about, and he was improving massively. But there was a huge difference between making Grandmaster norms and playing against the world's elite rated over 2700. And we're going to see this exactly in action, because the position on the board was reached after move 26, where Karjakin played rook a8, offering an exchange of rooks. What can we see about this position? Well, Sergei, of course, not anything down, but what he has, what White has, which is Topalov, what he has in his position as the positional trumps, is this lovely space advantage, like this. Black has absolutely no counterplay in this position. He would like to play f5, he would like to bring his knight to b4 somehow maybe, although even then that's not that efficient. And it's basically difficult to see what black can do. Again, bishop on g7, very poor piece. The bishop on b7, no scope whatsoever. What does white have? Well, white has the chance to attack weak pawns, like pawn on d6. If that pawn was to fall, probably the pawn on c5 is going to fall as well. And it's very impressive, the technique that Topalov shows in a rapid play game, in this game. Because there isn't much time to think, but he correctly decides in this position, yes, I need the major pieces on the board to possibly try and attack. But what I could also do is try and head to an endgame where I can try and outplay my young opponent. And he does this very nicely. First of all, he exchanges rooks, and then exchanges queens, like this. So, is Karjakin closer to the draw? Well, no, basically. The problem for black in this position is, as we said, the lack of scope of his pieces, and the new piece has now emerged as a huge target for white. Can you see which one that is? It's the knight on a8. Now, it's hard to imagine how white can actually win that knight, but the problem is that its squares of movement are being restricted by the bishop on d8. And whilst at the moment that's not terminal, it will be at some moment if black cannot actually do anything. On the other hand, what can white do? Well, white's king has the freedom of the board practically. Where do you think it should go? Well, the king could decide to go on a little march all the way around here, towards the queen side. And if black can't really do anything in the meantime, white is able to do whatever he wants with that piece. Finally, does black have any movements with his own king? Well, of course it can move to f8 and e8 and come into d7. But it doesn't really have anywhere else it can go. It's just a defending piece. So, all in all, we can sort of establish that Topalov's white has a big advantage. But how to put the young player away? Well, it's very nice the way he does this. So, he starts with bishop f8. I think that move is quite important. If king to f8, black's got to worry about moves like knight b5, and I'm not really... In fact, this is already losing. Because if king to e8, knight takes d6 check, knight takes b7 check, and knight takes c5. And it's already game over. So Topalov correctly realised that black was unable to do that, so he had to play bishop f8. But now where does the black king go? Because we've already talked about the black's route like this, but it's going to struggle to get out because the bishop on f8 is in the way. So, h4. Again, the white could have moved the king, but this is a really nice idea. Very, very grandmasterly like that move, because what he wants to do is play h5, and black is faced with a choice. The pawn on h6 will be fixed, which means it cannot move anywhere, and if black ever replies with g5, white can now play knight f5, And a knight on f5 would be a superb piece attacking these pawns. And black would be restricted to complete passivity in this game. We've already spoken about 3 minor pieces here not being able to do anything at all anyway, but now black's king would be rendered useless as well. So here we see that happen. King g7, knight b5, bishop c8, f3, and the idea of h5. There we go. And black's now going to be under a lot of problems. Probably he should have taken this, but I still think black is struggling. But instead, Karjakin played g5. He's attempting just to make a draw. Problem is, of course, that square on f5. It will always be a launch pad for the white knight, and these pawns on d6 are going to be available to be attacked at some moment. So, here comes the king. By the way, should white have exchanged off bishops? When you have more space, it's better to keep the pieces on, because then your opponent has less freedom within to move the pieces they have. And finally, that bishop on d8, remember, controlling the squares for the black knight to escape to. So, whilst bishop a5 seems obvious, many players, I would say club players, might have just exchanged off the bishops there, and that would definitely help black's task. So, general rule, if you've got a space advantage, try and keep the pieces on. King 8, and now knight a7. This is another lovely move because the knight reroutes around here. Again, what is the knight on a8 doing? It's kind of completely stuck. And here comes the king. It feels as though black's trying to put his pieces on starting squares again, but in reality there's not a lot he can do. So, and here we go. Knight b8 check. This move I like a lot. Because if, of course, well, apparently knight f5 was good as well. But if we go king b3, it's possible that black could now have played knight c7. And even though he would be in a pin, it's not clear how white can break through. But, of course, Topalov realizes after knight check, king b3, the knight is still restricted. It still cannot go to the squares it can move to. Very, very technical play from Topalov. So, bishop e7. If you look at the black's last, 10, 15 moves, he's achieved absolutely nothing. Whereas white's pieces, especially the white king, has emerged to infiltrate the black position. And once that happens, it's going to be game over. Knight b8 again, this time enabling white's king to head to b5. Here we go. And once the king gets there, well, it now looks at other squares, so the bishop has to retreat. I really like, by the way, white's manoeuvre of the knight, like this, manoeuvring round and manoeuvring to b8, and then back to c6, and then to d8, and just harassing black's pieces. You note the marked difference between the white knight and the black knight here. It's very, very different. Bishop c8. Knight f5. When I said you should not let your opponent exchange off pieces when you have a space advantage, the extra little twist to that is if your opponent has one good piece and say 2 bad pieces in this, like in this position, I'd probably say that the bishop on c8 is black's best minor piece. We don't mind exchanging that one off as long as we make sure that we keep their other pieces hemmed in like this. So black could of course take the knight on f5. But it wouldn't really solve anything. In fact, it would just get rid of his good bishop. So bishop e7, knight e6. Again, there are probably many ways that white could have won in this position, but we're just going to stick to what Topalov does. King a6. It's very nice to see how the king has made its way all the way across here. And if it does that, it's going to be game over. So bishop takes e6. Again, we could have just taken. There's nothing wrong with that. Bishop d8, and we're clearly winning here. But Topalov, again, accurate to the end as you'd expect from a 2700 player. Knight g7. And now the coup de grace in this position, king a7. So a big learning curve there for Karjakin. I'm sure he would have looked at that game and thought, well, I wasn't expected to win anyway. But what have I learned from that? Well, he learned this extremely fine technique from Topalov. And I'm sure it would have stood Karjakin in good stead for his future games, because he now knows, having played a 2700, what level they're playing at, and he would have aspired to that.